Today's episode is all about misinformation. And it's not about misinformation in the way that you have grown used to hearing about it, which is that it is a terrible thing that we must get rid of at all costs. Today's episode is about the value of misinformation, not just to science, but to the entire human project in general. And that might seem like a wild claim, but by the end of this video, you're going to understand not only why misinformation is so vital, but what it has to do with these.
The scientific revolution starts now.
Let us see the dark.
First case that we have to make is that misinformation has become something we are constantly being told that we should worry about. And that's a little bit weird because it's not actually even clear that misinformation is a worse thing today than it ever has been in the past.
Calls for such draconian interventions are commonly fueled by moral panic over claims that fake news has created a supposedly post-truth era. These claims falsely suggest an earlier fictitious golden age in which political debate was based on facts and truth. In reality, false information, misperceptions, and conspiracy theories are general features of human society.
But it is clear that these headlines and this discourse has led people to fear misinformation like never before.
Whether or not misinformation is a bigger deal today than it used to be, most people agree that it is a big problem. 95% of Americans polled reported that it gets in the way of them accessing important information. And 70% of news consumers reported that fake news is of increasing concern. Even scientists are reporting that misinformation has reached crisis proportions. All of this anxiety has opened the door for the state to step in and take care of the problem they first brought to our attention. So what are they going to do? Well, first, they've reappointed Robert Califf, a former pharma consultant, to the head of the FDA, where his first and foremost priority will be controlling misinformation.
Misinformation and disinformation really are the problems of our time. One important aspect of this commitment involves countering misinformation about science and the FDA that has become increasingly prevalent. Additionally, I believe that misinformation is now our leading cause of death, and we must do something about it.
We'll come back to Robert Califf and the role of the pharmaceutical industry in all of this in just a moment. But first, let's check out some other ways that the state is planning to protect you from misinformation.
It's how you hide a little lie, little lie. It's how you hide a little lie, little lie.
This is Nina Yankowicz. She is the brand new director of the government's brand spanking new Disinformation Governance Board. Since we started working on this video, the Disinformation Board was put on pause and Nina Yankowicz stepped down. However, the ideas still hold. The state is interested in curating information and they're going to keep looking for ways to do so. The goal of the Governance Board is exactly what you expect. They're going to deal with misinformation and disinformation as it burns like wildfire through our society. There's only one catch. As of right now, there's not actually statutory code that allows the government to police misinformation effectively, which is why they have to go after Section 230. I'll forgive you if you are not up to US telecommunications code and you don't know what Section 230 is. What it says is that the government is currently not able to hold a telecommunications provider liable for the content that is on their platform. And what that means is that you can make a phone call to somebody and you can plot something dastardly. You can plot a terrorist attack, assassinations, murder, crimes, whatever. And while you personally will be liable for what you've done, the phone company won't be. Which is why people like Obama are doing their best to make sure that Section 230 is fundamentally rewritten.
These big platforms need to be subject to some level of public oversight and regulation. Now, right now, a lot of the regulatory debate centers on Section 230 of the United States Code, which, as some of you know, says that tech companies generally can't be held liable for most content that other people post on their platforms. But let's face it, these platforms are not like the old phone company. And while I'm not convinced that wholesale repeal of Section 230 is the answer, it is clear that tech companies have changed dramatically over the last 20 years, and we need to consider reforms to Section 230.
If this rewrite happens, Facebook will be held financially liable for any misinformation posted on the website. And that is going to make these platforms that we all use to communicate with each other absolutely dysfunctional, because it is vital for us to be able to communicate ideas to each other, even if some of them happen to be false or dangerous.
Let's assume that the bureaucrats in charge are acting in good faith, and they're only going to police misinformation that's blatantly made up. Paradise should surely follow, right? Well, not really, because policing misinformation at the platform level isn't only going to target those people making things up. It's also going to affect anyone trying to get to the bottom of how things work. The very idea of misinformation assumes that somebody or some institution has access to pure objective truth. But who would that be?
Is it going to be the pharmaceutical companies, whose CEO is more than happy to say that the people who cast aspersions on a star product are criminals that have cost millions of lives, but then you look and you ask the question, did they cost millions of lives or did they cost millions of dollars? Because these drugs represent a $30 billion market share in a single year. So then you have another option. You have well-meaning nonprofits, like the Center for Countering Digital Hate. These people have put together a report called the Disinformation Dozen, where they say that just 12 people are responsible for 65% of the vaccine disinformation that circulates on the internet. And the end point of the report suggests that if you can get rid of these people, kick them off of all social media so that they don't have a platform, then you'll be able to have a free, clear, and presumably good internet. But then you go and you look at the board of this center, and you realize that the board is a YouTube star, some politicians, some bureaucrats, a PhD in anti-Semitism, and a grant writer. Are they actually capable of evaluating what is true? I would say no. I would say that what people have access to in large part in these organizations is just the truth that's written in the textbooks. And that's not actually truth, that's just the most popular ideas at the time that are codified and written down for future students, which makes any process of attempting to police misinformation a process of politics rather than of trying to understand the world.
A good example of this was the lab leak hypothesis. In March of 2020, a group of researchers wrote an open letter to The Lancet indicating that it was a conspiracy theory to suggest laboratory origins of COVID, in spite of the fact that there was a laboratory in Wuhan, China, where the virus originated that did study novel coronaviruses.
We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin.
This opened the doors for the fact-checkers to come out in droves. But then the Wall Street Journal published an article indicating that the science actually supported a lab leak hypothesis. And then the WHO came out saying that, yeah, it was possible. There was no apology or consideration of how we could have made better sense of the information in the first place. We just moved on.
And that is an absolutely terrible thing, because the minute that you arbitrarily decide what can and can't be talked about, you're already on the road to totalitarianism. If you want to know more about that argument, check out our conversation with Matthias Desmet that is linked up here for the podcast. We have to realize that we don't actually know a ton about viruses in general, even after all of this time that we've spent studying. Consider the human challenge trial. They took 36 healthy volunteers and they squirted sputum-containing virus into their nostrils. Of all of the participants, only 50% developed symptoms, which means that there's already something more than just germ theory deciding whether or not somebody's going to get sick. What's even weirder is the fact that the amount of virus RNA detected by RT-PCR seemed to have absolutely no correlation to the severity of symptoms. So what is going on? Discussing that would be tantamount to misinformation. But then if you realize how little we know about viruses, does that mean that discussing what makes people immune to HIV, or why only 1% of polio cases end in paralysis, or what about deadly flesh-eating bacteria? We have no idea why some people can have Staph aureus as part of their microbiome and never develop a staph infection. There's so much to talk about, and if we allow these misinformation censors to decide what we can and we cannot talk about, we'll never get there. And we're already seeing that this is starting to happen, because as soon as you start to discuss that perhaps germ theory doesn't have the whole story of how infections and sickness in biology works, you become labeled as a germ theory denialist.
This kind of thing is exactly why getting rid of misinformation is the same thing as getting rid of science. Contrarianism is the vital force that powers our search for understanding, which is why we as scientists need to have access to all information, even stuff that might turn out to be wrong down the line. But that does mean that we're going to have an ecosystem that's full of junk information.
So what can you actually do about it? First, you can train yourself to spot junk info. The way we do that is with a three-step process. First, we consider the mechanism. Is it consistent, clear, concise, and does it make use of all the existing evidence? Does it improve upon the previous theories, or is it just complaining about them? And what about that evidence? Are the starting assumptions reasonable? Does it gather evidence using a diverse array of methods? And finally, are there any rebuttals that you can research? The last thing we have to do is take care of the free-floating anxiety in our lives, because totalitarianism depends upon us being out of our minds and making poor decisions and signing on to structures that will undermine our liberties and our ability to make sense of what's happening. How do we get rid of anxiety? Well, we take control of our immediate environments. That means getting outside, getting your hands dirty, getting in the garden, getting to know your neighbors, making something real of the small pieces of your life that you can actually control, and not giving in to an overwhelming sense of anxiety.
The world is a beautiful place, and it's easy to forget it when you spend a lot of time on the internet, reading the news, focused on these things that drive you into a fever pitch of argument over who is right and who is wrong. Treat it more as a glorious adventure and find the ways to be able to make the life that is right in front of you fruitful and fulfilling, and the rest will take care of itself.
At the very least, be an active bystander and don't keep your mouth shut when you see things that don't make sense. And support us on Patreon. We'll see you next time.